Let's go.
All right. Hello. I am joined by Henry Preisman. Henry, welcome to the podcast.
Neil, thanks for having me. Good to be with you today.
You doing well in our current circumstances?
I'm trying to ride it out and not get too down or eat too much. That's the other problem. So I'm trying to do what I can to stay healthy and away from that virus.
Nice. Okay, so here's something I do with my guests. I like to do a rapid fire questions just to get us warmed up. And
sure.
Obviously, they're all centered around you. You choose an answer, or yes or no, and here we go. You ready?
Ready.
All right. I make friends easily.
No.
I have a vivid imagination.
No.
I worry about things.
Yes.
I love large parties.
Yes, I do.
Fancy socks or fancy shoes?
Fancy shoes.
Solve complex problems or sweep the deck at a cottage?
Solve complex problem.
Favorite sport?
Hockey.
Like a good Canadian boy. or as you've taken it on. Good looks or lots of money?
Lots of money.
A place in the world you'd like to visit?
Place in the world I'd like to visit. I've always wanted to go to South America, do a tour of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, something like that. For some reason, I've always wanted to do that.
Nice, yes. Some of the other the great destinations that I've heard so far: Australia, Puerto Vallarta, so I'm sure I've not been down to South America. I would love to go at some point. Have you been down there at all?
I've never been. That's a continent I've never been to. Read a lot about it, and one day I'll get there.
Okay, so not too soon because we need your services. So
yeah,
obviously, Henry, as I introduce you, you're a real estate lawyer and also a teacher as well. Are there any other things that I've missed in there?
Those are my two current professions. I've practiced real estate law since 1994, so 26 years now and counting. And I've taught some courses at Seneca College for the last approximately 10 years.
Yeah.
That's kind of an adjunct part-time professor teaching in their teaching a law course and an ethics course, primarily to technical students. But at the beginning, I did some teaching in the law clerk faculty as well.
Okay. And have you always been? Has your practice always been located in Toronto, Ontario?
Yeah, I started my practice is currently located across the hall from where I initially started. So, same building since the beginning. I did, when I started after law school, I worked for a firm. I was downtown, and that's where I articled and started practicing as a lawyer. And then when a friend of mine, also named Neil, and I decided to go on our own. Good guy. And another brand guy named Neil. We opened an office and we started practicing in Scarborough.
Oh wow! So, I mean, how'd you get into law in the first place?
Well, I tell a story.
How'd you get into real estate law?
Yeah, so as far as law, when I went to university, I was in the BCom program. I was going to do something in finance. I'm an accountant, maybe in the financial field. And then I hung out with these guys at U of T, where I went to undergrad, who wanted to be lawyers. And they were all studying for the LSAT, and they wanted to be lawyers. And they said, no, come on, take the test. And I said, I don't want to. I'm not interested. And they kept, come on, do it. Like, we're all going to take it. You take it too. So I finally gave in, and I took it. and I got in and they didn't. So when I did well, and I was kind of at the point where I was pretty sure I'd be accepted somewhere.
Yeah.
I had a hard think to myself as to whether I was going to go to law school or not. And I thought to myself, well, I need a career, I need a job. I need to make a living somehow, so why not try this? And if I don't like it, I can always switch to something else. And it's always a good degree to have, even if you're not working in the field, right? Having a law degree will open a few doors. And, that's how I decided to get into the racket. And as far as real estate law, I liked it. I initially started doing litigation. When I started, it was the recession of the early 90s, the real estate bust and all that. And the firm I started working for, they did all the power sales, the litigation for banks, collections, all kinds of other sophisticated litigation too. But I found that I liked the transactional nature of what the real estate lawyers did. Mm-hmm. I liked the deal, doing the deal, completing the deal. I found litigation to be interminable. It lasted for years and years. Yeah. And then maybe there was a trial, and then somebody appealed. And it never ended. Right. And I didn't appeal to me. I like, the fact that you got a deal done, you moved on to the next one, and I like the transactional nature of it.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Actually, I've found in life, for me in general, I've always enjoyed any job where you can actually start something and complete it and be able to evaluate it, as opposed to professions that jobs that you just do repetitively and carry on with. Even when I used to work in human resources, and I had an opportunity to work in payroll way back, and I thought, nope, you do the same thing every week after, and they got paid really well, but I thought, no, I couldn't do it. I needed to, I needed the transactional nature as well. That's interesting.
Yeah, I can't explain exactly why I like that, but yeah. I always have, and it really gravitated toward that kind of work.
Yeah, yeah. So that was interesting what you're just talking about with regards to initially handling defaults and things like that. Can you share any of the things that you saw at that time, or that you found yourself learning at that time? Because obviously it would have been early in your career in going through all of these types of defaults. And
yeah, I mean, aside from the purely technical and legal nature of things, which you learn because that's the nature of your job, which I don't think your audience would be interested in. You learned a lot about, I think, you learned a little bit about human nature and how sometimes people don't do the rational thing. They don't do the logical thing. A lot of people, when they can't pay their mortgage and the bank goes power sale, forecloses on them because of non-payment, they wait till the very last second. It's almost like as if they're stunned and they're unable to do anything. The logical thing to do, of course, would be to sell the property yourself to recoup as much of the equity as you can and not wait for the bank to run up fees and interest and so on.
Yeah.
But I found very few people actually were able to motivate themselves or to reason things through that way, to do that, where, of course, they'd be in a much better situation if they did. They might be able to get some money out, or they wouldn't have to go bankrupt, or they could do things on their own terms. I found a lot of people waited to the last second till the sheriff was at the door knocking before they even attempted to do anything. I think you probably have the same experience in your line of work, right?
Well, I've definitely seen this too, and I'm curious, when you say that, do you have any idea why people do that?
It almost seems a kind of psychological paralysis, where they can't accept or they can't decide that, this is it. We can't pay. We can't keep this house. We've got to do something else. Mm-hmm. I don't know it's an interesting psychological phenomenon. I'm not a psychologist, I can't tell you why people do this.
Right.
But I can tell you that it's a very common occurrence. So I saw that, which struck me as odd.
Right.
I saw people who would throw their loved ones under the bus. You know, the son or daughter who would buy a business or start a business and get mom and dad to mortgage their house, so that the bank will lend them the money, and then they'd stop paying, and then they would bail on mom and dad and leave them to their own devices. I thought that was quite a terrible thing to do to parents, especially who were prepared to help you out and, you know, risk everything that they've accumulated in their professional lives and their working lives for that child. So I saw all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And most of them, you know, not positive of human nature.
Yeah.
But these are the things that you've got to or that you learn, I guess, when you go into the working world, and you learn what the world's like instead of what you think or you want it to be like.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, obviously, dark times can bring out the dark nature in people, but that's interesting. So
the other thing, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I didn't realize, I was pretty young, you know, just out of school, but I didn't realize how much debt people were prepared to take on, often without anything to show for it.
Yeah.
You know, just discretionary spending, vacations, cars.
You're talking about
boats.
what you saw in the 90s.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, this is not just a 90s phenomenon. I think it happens all the time when money's easy.
Yeah.
People will spend it to have a good time, and then they don't really know how to pay it back.
Yeah.
Or have no plan B in case something goes wrong.
Yeah.
Right? So I saw that too. And that's one of the things that surprised me the most is how much people were prepared to borrow without a concrete plan to repay it. Right?
Well, speaking as a kid who once got a credit card fairly young, didn't understand it, got into a bunch of debt really quickly. You know, it definitely I remember in the best of intentions, you think, okay, when I get my next paycheck, I'll pay that off. But then within that time, and you do that a few times, pay it off, and then, okay, I'll catch up on it next time. And before you know it, it's snowballed, and that credit card is maxed out, right? And that's, at least that was only a credit card for, you know, a few $1,000s, but at that time. Now, of course, you know, people are picking up all sorts of debt, and whether it be cars or much higher lines of credits and credit cards and the like, right?
Yeah.
Using it in the same way.
I think as time has gone on, it's become a lot easier to get into debt.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of products available, lines of credit and credit cards and all kinds of payday loans. Some of these things weren't around back then, that people can access to get further and further into debt. Student loans are a big deal now, where, you know, back in the 90s, that really wasn't a big issue.
Yeah.
So people will borrow and have no idea how they're going to repay it.
So here's an interesting one. Something that I've thought about at times is, as we kind of move as a society further away from.
Oh, sorry, Neil.
Right, got an earthquake going on.
Yeah.
As we move further and further away from actual physical currency, and, you know, as we move further away from actually having currency in our hand that we pass over, and we're more and more into this, everything is tapping, you know, tap to the card. Do you think there's a correlation, just obviously not your legal opinion, but personal opinion, do you think there is a correlation between like a disconnect by not having?
I think you're right. I think it's becoming a lot easier to spend money.
Yeah.
You just tap your card. You put in the card chips. You Apple Pay on your phone.
Yeah.
The method of payment, the e-transfer, it's become a lot easier to spend money. Back when you had to take bills out of your pocket and count them and hand them over.
Yeah. The pocket was empty.
Yeah. I think you really kind of had a realization. I'm spending real money.
Yeah.
Kind of brought home the fact that, yes, this is money. I'm spending money. Should I be doing this? Is this a worthwhile purchase? Whereas now, the numbers don't even hit you until you get your statement at the end of the month.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden people have, thousands of dollars credit card debt, and that's it. They can't pay it back. They're in the minimum payment cycle, and it's down the drain from there on forward. Sometimes I do refinances for people where they take out equity in their home to pay off debts, and the amount of credit card debt I see that needs to be paid is unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, I don't ask the clients what it is that they bought, but it seems to me that a lot of people don't have a lot to show for it other than some long forgotten vacations and restaurant meals long since eaten.
That's interesting. The accounting is always done after the fact, right? When the bill comes, then you tend to do the accounting for it, as opposed to when you had the money in your pocket and had to pull it out. That accounting happens immediately. Now, back then, it was if you were buying a house, down payment was still 20 or 25%.
The non-CMHC down payment was 25%.
Yeah.
You could get CMHC insurance back then. The minimum was 10%.
Yeah.
So you had to pony up 10. I mean, the prices were a lot lower back then, but people made less money.
Yeah.
It was a little bit more challenging to buy a house because you needed more of a down payment.
Well, I remember in the 80s, you still had to have 25% down. I'm not sure when CMHC started doing high ratio when they started coming in, but I remember that 25% down. Of course, I also remember some house prices being, $30,000 to $50,000 for some places still. So.
I mean, look, back in the late 70s when my parents bought a house in North York, rates were really high. Like they were high double-digit rates.
Yeah.
And it was common for the seller, if they wanted to sell their house, to take back a mortgage.
Right.
So you put down your 25-30%. The seller would take back the mortgage for the rest, and you pay them off over time.
Well, that's good. Can you explain a take-back mortgage?
Sure, it's when the seller of the property kind of takes back a loan for part of the purchase price. So you don't pay them the full amount.
Yeah.
They don't get all the cash in their pocket. You pay them a certain percentage, and the rest you owe them. Right? It's almost like buying a car from a car company. They'll give you the car.
Yeah.
But you have to pay for it over time to the car manufacturer, the car dealer, the finance company. That's more common with big companies. It's not very often that an individual who sells a house was going to take back that mortgage or take back that note. But it was happening a lot simply because people couldn't qualify for mortgages and couldn't get those, couldn't pay those rates. So if you wanted to sell your house, you had to do it that way.
So now with that take back mortgage, would that have been in first or second position?
First, it was a first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they took back the sellers would take back a 75% or 70% first mortgage.
Wow, interesting.
Because that was the only way they could sell the property.
Yeah, yeah. Different times for sure. Okay, so let's bring it forward now. Just with regards to regular residential buyers and sellers, what are some of the biggest hiccups, mistakes that you see happening in transactions?
Well, they vary from time to time. Sometimes one becomes more common than another. But I'll give you kind of a smattering of what I've seen over the last couple of years, where purchasers, especially purchasers, because the seller can make fewer mistakes because they own the property and they know all about it. A few years ago, when house prices were going through the roof and there were bidding wars on every property, it became common practice for buyers not to require an inspection.
Right.
They bought it as is. They would not even insert a condition to have a property inspected. They would buy it as is because they knew that no seller would accept an offer that was conditional when other people were.
You got to a point where you were waiving all conditions, and people were even putting above asking, just to try to win the bid.
Win the bidding war.
Yeah.
And sometimes the buyers were lucky and the house was in good condition. And sometimes the buyers weren't so lucky and the house was not in good condition. And they discovered only after the fact, after they bought it, paid for it, that there were a lot of problems with electrical, structural, the roof. The furnace was on its last legs, or the air conditioning needed to be replaced. All kinds of issues. And they often had no money to rectify them.
Right.
But the law is, caveat emptor, resale housing, buyer beware.
Yeah.
If there's no conditions or there's no fraud on the part of the seller, you buy it, it's yours.
Right.
So that's one thing I saw.
Yeah.
Another thing that I see more commonly now is people buying a property and for whatever reason not being able to qualify for a mortgage. Because don't forget, when you go and you pre-qualify for a mortgage, all those pre-qualifications are conditional.
That's right.
The bank says, yes, we'll lend you the money, but you have to prove your income, you have to prove down payment, you have to have a certain credit score, you have to have a job or a job letter. All those things have to come later. And if you are not aware of that, and you don't have it, it doesn't matter that you have a pre-qualification, you're not going to get that money. The bank isn't going to lend you that money, or the appraisal doesn't come in for the value that you paid for it. The bank's appraiser thinks the property's worth less than what the buyers agreed to pay. So for all those reasons, you can't either get a mortgage, or you can't get as much of a mortgage as you need, so you don't have the money to close.
Yeah.
Which means you are in default.
Obviously, being in the industry, I've seen some interesting things. People buying trucks
right before the closing,
and then they no longer qualify. Their debt servicing ratios get thrown off, or people thinking that they can hide various loans or all these types of purchases. So definitely.
Yeah, you're right. The car lease right before the closing is a classic. Yes.
Yeah, or borrowing money from a family member and thinking that won't show up. I mean, there's all sorts of different things that happens. Of course, at one point in time, a lot of these things were perfectly fine and weren't even considered.
Yeah, and another one that happens, although more rarely, is the job switch.
Yes.
Yes, I bought a house. Well, now I'm going to switch jobs for a higher paying one. All of a sudden, you're not employed at the same place for 5 years.
Yes.
You're a new employee somewhere else, and the banks don't like that. So.
Yeah, that's true, and obviously it's created issues that way. But I want to come back to something that you mentioned earlier about fraud with the sellers specifically. What type of if someone's waiving all of the conditions, if a buyer puts in an offer and waives all the conditions, is there any way for the seller to actually be involved in any fraud? I mean,
well, sellers, fraud of that sort usually happens when the seller either isn't the owner, they're pretending to be the owner, and they're selling a house that doesn't belong to them. Or the seller is an owner, but there's another owner or owners that don't know the property is being sold. And the sellers, of course, are the fraudsters trying to pocket all the money from that sale and run away.
Yeah. Okay. You got to ask about that because, we hear about such things, but does it really happen?
Yeah, it happens not as much as it used to, but it still happens relatively frequently. I'll give you an example. Somebody rents a house, okay?
Yeah.
The owner of the house may be living in another country, another part of the country, may not be around the property very often. The tenant, gives the realtor who leases the property on behalf of the owner a whole bunch of post-dated checks. That realtor forwards them to their client, and that person cashes those checks wherever they live.
Mhm.
The tenant is in possession of the property, right?
Right. Yeah.
If you don't know who that tenant is or who the owner is, it's difficult for you to know that they're not the owner. If they're pretending to be the owner,
Hmm.
and they have some ID that they've come across or that they've created that has the name of the owner, it's sometimes fairly easy for them to impersonate the owner, sell the property, pocket the money, and make a break for it.
Wow. What measures are there that are in place to stop that type of fraud?
Well, lawyers and realtors are now required to ask for ID, government issued ID, like a driver's license or a passport. The money is from the sale of the property is only to be made payable to the registered owner, so it can't go to a third party. So that makes it more difficult to perpetrate a fraud because it's got to go through a bank account in the name of the owner.
Right.
We're taught to look for signs of fraud, indications of fraud. Does that person have ownership documents to give to their lawyer? Do they have a deed? Do they have a survey? Do they have a property tax bill? Where's their insurance policy? Right? If you don't have them, it might tend to indicate that you're not the owner because the owners have those documents.
Right. It
Right?
should raise a number of red flags.
Right. So when someone says, well, maybe they have lost them, or maybe they're absent-minded and they're put them somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
But it causes you to say to yourself, well, maybe we should dig a little bit more and find out what's going on. From a buyer's point of view, the most important thing they can do is get title insurance as part of their purchase. And one of the risks title insurance protects a buyer against is if they bought a property that was fraudulently sold to them.
Right.
And they'll reimburse you in full for your entire purchase price. They'll pay off the bank that lent you the money, everything.
Yeah.
If you're the innocent victim of a fraud.
Yeah. Now what happens? You find out that home was not yours, or not the seller's to sell. Would it go back to the original owner, or what transpires in that situation?
Yes.
You have to
So
move
up until about maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't clear
right.
who would have the final ownership of the property. But there was a case in the Court of Appeal where the Ontario Court of Appeal finally decided that yes, it would go back to the real owner, the one who was the innocent party that was defrauded.
Who never actually sold it.
Who never actually sold it. And what people couldn't get their heads around was that for many years the law was, well, we're not sure. Is it the innocent buyer or the innocent owner that got defrauded that should keep the property? Because you can imagine it was quite hard for these people who were defrauded to believe that I didn't sell my house. Somebody fraudulently sold it. What do you mean I can't get it back?
Yeah. Yeah.
But of course, as I said, that case law has been kind of put to bed. So
yeah.
we know now.
And the price, as whatever the price might have been that you might end up receiving, it still may not be enough. It could be a family property. And
yeah, listen, there was a case where there was a property owner who owned a farm who lived in Europe. Like he owned this property, and I don't remember what use somebody was making of it. But the owner, the real owner, lived in Europe. He inherited it from mom and dad, but he lived in Europe. And somebody sold it out from under him, impersonated him, sold it to a developer because it was a farm out near Oakville somewhere. And by the time the real owner came home, found out that he'd been defrauded. The developer had already built a subdivision on it. So it had gone through a number of owners, from him to the developer, to people who bought homes from the developer, and sometimes they even resold those homes to a new buyer.
Wow.
Right? So it got through several owners by the time this guy figured out that he'd been defrauded.
Wow.
So we've had cases like that.
Just out of curiosity, do you know the outcome of that case? Because you can't give it back to him at that point.
No, it was a very complex case, and I think what happened was that the title insurance companies that insured all the owners at the time had to settle with this real owner and pay them. Of course, he couldn't get the property back. There were already houses there, right?
Yeah.
So, so he got a settlement for the money.
Wow, that's great. Well, don't go to Europe and leave your farm behind.
Exactly. That's what we take away from that.
Okay, so now let's get into what I was really hoping we would be able to talk about more is get into the investment side, right? Obviously, this is the Leadership to Wealth podcast, and we want to talk about how do people utilize real estate to build their wealth, and what are some of the different ways that you've seen people utilizing, whether it be different strategies and things like that, to be able to invest in real estate?
I mean, there are a lot. Real estate is a very popular, obviously, investment, and especially in the last decade or so, real estate prices in the
as they say,
GTA,
it's not making any more.
Yes, they're not making it anymore. And so real estate has been a very popular investment. There are a number of techniques that people use to invest in real estate. Some of the more common one that people I think already know about is you buy a property and you rent it out. So the tenant pays you rent, and that rent defrays your costs, your property taxes, mortgage, insurance, other things you have to pay. And hopefully you make a profit between what you collect in rent and what you pay out. And over time, hopefully the property appreciates. So you build equity that way. You pay down your mortgage, price goes up, you build equity, and you have a little bit of income. So that's one very common, very popular technique that's used. A second one that's widely known is the flip. You buy a rundown property, you fix it up, you sell it. There's a million of those shows on TV. Flip this house, flip that house, flip your house, flip my house.
Yep.
All right. They're all over the TV. And I think people have seen those. Maybe they know other people who've done it for many years. A lot of people are involved in doing those kind of flips. And they can range from a cosmetic flip to something structural where you almost take the house down to the studs and build it back up. So that's a second technique that people use. A third strategy is the investing in pre-construction, where you buy a house or a condo. In the Toronto area recently, it's been condos, where you buy it off a plan from a developer, and you know that it's not going to be ready for 4 or 5 years. And you hope that in that 4 or 5 year period, the price goes up. So you can either sell it or you can refinance and get your money out that way, or rent it out. But you've made money while it's being built because of the ambient appreciation of the market. Right? So that's a third strategy. And a fourth is kind of a little bit different, one that I'm most particularly interested in, and that's lending money on the security of mortgages.
Right.
These are called private mortgages, where people who have savings lend money to others on the security of real estate, and they get paid interest for the privilege of borrowing their money, and they're repaid when the maturity of the loan comes up. And if the borrower doesn't repay, just like the bank, the lender sells the property, forecloses, sells under power of sale to recoup their money. The real estate, the house, the building, the land is the collateral, the security for that loan. So these are some of the more common ones. They're more esoteric ones, but those are the 4 most common ones that I see. Right?
Yeah. the buy, rent, fix, flip, the pre-construction, and then private lending or private mortgage.
lending. Yeah.
So can you speak to some of the legal concerns in each of those strategies?
Well, if you're buying a house or a condominium to rent out, and the property has already been built, you see it, you inspect it, you do all the right things before you buy it. Your main risk, legal risk, is being a landlord in this province. Being a landlord in Ontario is not easy, because the laws are written generally for the benefit of the tenant.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, you're restricted as to how much you can raise the rent in a given year. The government of Ontario tells you how much you can raise the rent,
Mm-hmm.
and it's generally a very low percentage. It's very difficult to get tenants out even when they haven't paid or damaged your property. You can't just kick them out. You've got to go through the landlord-tenant tribunal. You've got to get an order. You've got to get the police to enforce the eviction order.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it takes quite a bit of time. And if your tenant is a wily and experienced,
Mm-hmm.
what I call the professional tenant, they know how to work the system to stay there for free for as long as possible. So that's I think a significant risk there.
Right.
As far as the fix and flip, there are insurance considerations. If you're buying a house, no one's living there, you're flipping it, you're renovating it, you got to make sure you get the right insurance, because just a standard homeowner policy isn't going to cut it. If you have a fire or an electrical problem or a flood and your house is under construction, your insurance company is likely not to pay off, because that's not what those policies are for. So you have to get a special policy for construction. You've got the potential for liens. If you are using a contractor and that contractor has a subcontractor who you may not have even known, you've never made a deal with them, but they come and do work on the property, and your contractor doesn't pay them, even though you've paid the contractor, that sub can put a lien on the property, and you got to make sure to hold back enough money from the contractor to pay the subcontractor. So you got to just don't assume that since you've paid your contractor that he's paid all his contractors. So you got to worry about that too.
That sounds like good advice even for the regular homeowner.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how many people. Well, maybe you wouldn't be. Have six-figure renovations done on a handshake or on a one-page, piece of paper.
Yeah.
And whether it's not clear what the completion date's supposed to be, who's going to be working on your property, what the scope of the work is, what materials are going to be used. So contractors are unlicensed, most of them.
Yeah.
So a lot of them are unscrupulous. They take your money and run, or they take your deposit and use it to buy material for another job. Lots of horror stories there.
Yeah.
As far as the pre-construction purchase, you are signing a contract to buy a condo or a house that has been prepared by the builder's lawyers.
Yes.
And as you might expect, there's not much in there that favors the buyer, but a lot of things in there that favor the builder. So delays if they can't build on time, the ability to change the property in a non-material way if they need to, the extra costs that they hide and sprinkle through the contract that they don't tell you about, all kinds of things. And if you are a buyer who intends to sell the contract before the property is built at a profit, there are clauses in there that say you can't do that without the builder's consent. So you better make sure that you can get the builder's consent or put a clause in the contract that allows you to do so without requiring or being required to jump through a lot of hoops by the builder, or a lot of fees, which is also a problem.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I don't have much experience myself with pre-construction, and I've heard from a number of people that have actually identified that this assignment clause, which a lot of people would try to use in pre-construction, has been pretty much removed, and and for the most part has cleared up that opportunity for people to buy the pre-construction and then just flip the paper and
yeah, which is exactly what a lot of people plan to do. They plan to flip the paper to somebody else.
yeah,
And that's not necessarily doable unless the builder says it's okay.
yeah,
And if the builder says, well, it's not okay, or give me $20,000
yeah,
to make it okay,
yeah.
you got a bit of a problem.
Now that's an interesting one. Why would the lawyers put that in there to stop that process from happening?
Well, I think a lot of times they don't want, if the builder has unsold units, they don't want the buyers competing with the builder for the unsold units, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times they don't want the image of the building to be such that a lot of people are trying to get out and sell their contracts to other people. So those are two reasons why not. And third of all, I think they want to control the process, right? They want to know, because eventually they're going to have closing with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd like to know who they're closing with. Because the paper's been flipped a few times and Joe Blow comes to closing and says, well, I'm the buyer now.
Yeah.
They really don't know what's going on, right?
Right.
So they try to screen their buyers to make sure that they can get financing, that they got some money, that their credit's okay, and that the paper's not flipped 100 times or however many times to somebody who maybe can't close, right? So for all those reasons, they try to control that process.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Now, it would seem to me that in a pre-construction deal, even if you could get that to happen, you're looking for the quick buck. You're trying to, well, when I say quick, meaning however many years it takes, a couple of years for that to finally get built, or 3 years for that to finally get built, and you're just looking for that margin difference, and away you go. Is there any other strategy around pre-construction beyond that?
You got to be very careful with pre-construction too, because there are a lot of tax landmines as well.
Okay.
As you probably know, I'm sure you know, but maybe some of your audience doesn't know. People have not been declaring the income or the profit that they make in doing these flips.
Yeah.
So at least until recently, until CRA got preoccupied with other things, they've been very, shall we say, cognizant of this, and they're going after people who have been flipping properties, whether they're flipping the paper or they're flipping houses, to collect the tax.
Mm-hmm.
And people think that if you're, if you're flipping this contract, that it's a capital gain.
Right.
But in most cases, CRA considers that to be business income.
Okay.
So it's taxed at a very different rate than the capital gain. It's taxed at double the rate. So people think that, oh, I'm only paying this much tax. And the CRA says, no, you're paying that much tax because this is really a business. You've gone into a trade of some kind. Right? This is a business venture, not an investment.
Right. This wasn't a situation where you sold it because you realized you weren't going to be able to close on the property. This is something that you've done repeatedly.
Right. So this is a business venture for you, and This was your intention to sell. So they're going after you for the full tax, and they're also saying, why didn't you collect the HST, which you should have? So we want the 13% as well. So sometimes it's a tax nightmare. Right. You got to be very careful on those.
Right.
It sounds easy, you pay your down payment, you sign a piece of paper, you go and do your thing for 3 or 4 years, and then you flip the paper and you make all this money.
Yeah.
Right. Easy peasy. Well, not so much.
Yeah. Well, people are espousing it's the vast wealth that you could build with it, and then realizing that there were a lot of pitfalls in that. I'm sure there's still a lot of individuals that are capitalizing on that from a personal residence. If you're doing that, I'm sure you're getting it at a much lower price than waiting for it to be built and then buying it. But from an investor business standpoint, it's probably not the opportunity that it once was.
It's not. It's tougher to do. Builders have caught on. They're charging higher prices. The CRA's caught on, and they're collecting taxes more diligently.
Yeah.
And real estate prices sometimes go down.
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
They don't always go up. People don't know that. They don't realize sometimes real estate prices actually go down.
Yeah.
They will soon, but they do. And when that happens, and you can't sell it, and you have to close, and maybe this is not your principal residence, you need another mortgage, and you have one on your house, and the bank doesn't want to lend it to you, you've got a big, big problem.
Yeah.
Because you've already put that huge deposit down, and the builder isn't going to give it back to you.
Yeah.
So you've got some issues.
Wow. Okay. So now my personal favorite, number 4.
Yeah, my personal favorite too. So private mortgages I like because it is you don't have the headaches of ownership, right? You don't have to own the properties. You have to deal with tenants.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to deal with leaky roofs. You don't have to deal with furnaces that don't heat, etc. Right? You don't have any of that. You lend your money on the security of a mortgage, and you get paid interest. You are effectively the bank. And all you're concerned about there is to make sure that you get a good estimate of the value of the property that you're lending money against, and that you know what else is owed against that property. So if you're not in first position on a mortgage, well, how much is owing on the first mortgage? And how much am I lending? And what's the property worth? Right? So you only lend a certain loan to value. You don't lend for the full value. You lend for less, no more than 80 or maybe 85% at the most. So there's a margin of error that if the money isn't paid back, you can sell the property and recoup your money that you've lent to this person who isn't able to or doesn't want to pay you back. Right? Then you also get to do a lot of due diligence about them beforehand. What do they do for a living? How much money do they make? What's their credit score? What's their past history, and so on, right? It's a little bit more creative, I think.
Yeah.
And you get to deal with a lot of different properties. Maybe you can only buy 1 or 2 properties in your lifetime.
Yeah.
But when you're doing mortgages and you do them for your term, you can lend against dozens over an investing career.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you can lend $20,000. You can lend $200,000. You can lend $2 million, depending how much money you have to lend or how much you want to invest in this particular asset class. So much flexibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, I'm biased being in this field and specializing in that. But why don't you share with us some of the mistakes that you see investors making when they go into private mortgages?
I think the 2 most common mistakes are not doing your proper full due diligence, right? So getting the current appraisal done, not checking out the borrower properly, not doing the work that you need to do to make sure that this is a good opportunity as opposed to one that you should be passing on. The other mistake I see lenders making is they lend on properties that they often don't understand, right? So if you don't know a lot about or have little experience with commercial properties, well, maybe you shouldn't be lending money on those, and vice versa. Different people have different interests or different comfort levels. Some people will only lend on properties in the city or urban properties. I have lenders who will only deal in GTA property. Some people only do commercial because they know they can get the tenant out if they don't pay. Some people only want to do condos because they have an idea what the value is because the condos are so similar in a particular location. So you got to be comfortable with the property. You got to do your due diligence with the lender, with the borrower, excuse me, as a lender. And you've got to realize that you don't invest more than you can afford to. I think that's true of any investment, but because you can't guarantee that somebody will pay you every month. And if you're counting on that money to live on, to pay your bills, that's not money you should be investing in a private mortgage. It's something that should be in a safer government-backed investment, not in an asset class like this one.
Yeah. And obviously, I see that in coordinating private mortgages and handling them. I see that happen where sometimes people will advise that they have X, Y, Z, dollars, and then meanwhile, what they really mean is that they've got a line of credit which they are planning on using. And for some people's benefit, I understand they use that as a strategy where they will use a line of credit to lend that money out on.
And that can be a good strategy, but you've got to be, I think, a more sophisticated investor than the beginner.
Right.
I know people who've used it, use it effectively. It can be a very good strategy, but it's got to be coupled with more experience than the average investor.
Yeah, because of course, if there's any sorts of problems, you're still going to have that payment for your line of credit, and if you have to go through the process of taking the home and selling the home to get that to recoup that money, then what are you going to do in the meantime?
That's right. Your bank, your lender doesn't care that you can't collect from the person you lent the money to. They want to be paid, and they want to be paid on time. Yeah. And if you can't do that while you're waiting to foreclose or to power sale your borrower, then you can't afford to invest that money.
Well, okay, so let's since we're going down this road, let's just talk about that. If someone doesn't pay, then what's the options for the lender, the investor in this situation? What's the options for them?
Well, there are three main ones. They're called foreclosure, number one, power sale, and a lawsuit. The third one isn't necessarily an independent one. But a foreclosure, and people throw this word around a lot because it's used in the States a lot. Mm-hmm. But in Canada, foreclosure means that you take the property and the debt goes away. So you've lent somebody money, you've got a mortgage on their property, foreclose on them. That means now you're the owner of the property, but that borrower no longer owes you any money. It's like a trade, a mortgage for property. Okay, you become the owner. The debt is extinguished, and you've now got, instead of this loan, you've got this piece of property. Okay, so that's number one. Power sale, which is by far the most common one in Canada, is when you sell the property to a third-party buyer because the borrower has defaulted on the mortgage and you are exercising the right to sell the property because of that non-payment or that default. The default is something else. And when the property is sold, you get your money back. So you get your principal, your interest, your cost, your fees, anything that you can get, you can recoup from that power sale. And then the property belongs to this third-party buyer who's paid for it. Mm-hmm. And you sell it not as the owner, but as the lender, as the bank.
Right.
And the third option is to sue the borrower for the money and to collect the proceeds in a lawsuit. This is pretty unusual. And the only time somebody would do that is they knew there was a big pile of cash that the borrower was going to come into, an inheritance, a divorce settlement, something coming down the road that they can get without having to bother with the property and selling and all that stuff.
Oh, okay.
So I would say over 90% of the time, maybe 95% of the time, what the mortgage lender does if there's a default is sell under power of sale to recoup the money.
So now, in what situation would an investor to go for foreclosure rather than power of sale?
Well, imagine you've lent somebody, $100,000 on a mortgage, and the property's worth $200,000. Mm-hmm. If you foreclose, you become the owner of a $200,000 property, and you give up a $100,000 mortgage. Mm-hmm. So you've effectively doubled your money. Mm-hmm. And it's more advantageous, more lucrative to own the property, which is worth more than the money you've lent.
Right.
So sometimes people try to do that.
Yeah.
Now, if the borrower is smart, he can convert your foreclosure action into a power sale to
Okay.
avoid this very same thing. Sometimes people foreclose because they really need that property because they're assembling for a subdivision, or they want to expand the one they own next door, or some unique reason, and that's why they want to own it as opposed to sell it for money.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I've heard of a situation where there were two guys side by side, owned commercial properties, the kind with the store on the main floor and an apartment upstairs.
Yeah.
And the one that lent the neighbor the money really wanted to develop the property into like townhouses, right? So when there was a default, he foreclosed, even though that for anyone else that would have been foolish. But he foreclosed because then he would have owned it, and now he can sell to a developer because he's got the assembled land, right?
Okay.
So in those situations, it makes sense. In most situations, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Now, in the situation where if you were in first position and there was a second position mortgage on the property and you were to try and foreclose, what happens to the person in second position?
If you're foreclosing, the person in second position stays there. They become a first mortgage because your mortgage is now extinguished and you become the owner.
Oh, okay.
Right. So that's another reason not to foreclose, because then you have somebody else's mortgage that you end up paying.
Okay.
So if you go power sale, then you have priority over everyone because you are in first position.
Very interesting. Okay. So, but now there are times when you can go ahead and try it and foreclose if the homeowner does not take action to have it moved over to a power of sale. Then you could be in a situation where you acquire a property at a greatly reduced price.
Yes, it happens
without the requirement to provide a fair market value to the homeowner.
Yeah.
Because,
it is.
correct me if I'm wrong. In a situation, if you were to have the first mortgage on a property and you were to go into power of sale,
Mm-hmm.
it would be your duty to still try to acquire fair market value for the.
Absolutely, you have to sell it for a reasonable fair market value.
Right.
And if there's money left over after you get paid, that money goes to the owner.
Right.
That belongs to them. You can't keep it.
Right.
But if you foreclose, there's no money. You just become the owner of the property.
Right.
And obviously, that can lead to a lot of unfairness, which is why this, under the Mortgages Act, the borrower can make foreclosure into a power of sale action to prevent this kind of thing.
Right. Right.
I've seen it a couple of times. I don't remember the last time I've seen a foreclosure actually go through, but I've seen in recent years people who've tried to foreclose for this very same reason, and the borrowers, because they got legal advice, have not allowed that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, both times it was attempted by someone who we both know, whose name I won't mention on this podcast. But if you're curious, I'll tell you who it was later. You'll probably guess.
I already know. Yes. Yeah. I'm sure. And actually, as you were discussing this, I was immediately thinking about the person who I know does this more than anyone else. They attempt to acquire the properties, and obviously, it's not very fair to the homeowner.
Mm-hmm.
But they're trying to make as much as they can in that situation, and I understand that as well, even if I don't agree with it.
I find that to be predatory, and I think it's disgraceful. But it's allowed if the borrower is unsophisticated and has no money to go to a lawyer, or is just given up. Right. And is too depressed to do anything. It can definitely happen.
Right. Now that's interesting, because I'm sure I'd be curious to find out some of the benefits of of why the foreclosure process was originally created. Not that we'll discuss it at this point in time, but I'm sure there's probably some reasoning behind how they came to the creation of the foreclosure process. But we can always discuss that.
For your legal history podcast, we'll
Yeah, that's right. I think that my nerdy side is coming out just a little bit too much there. Obviously, you know how much I love contract law and getting involved in the contracts themselves. But so now, what are some of the, in many years, what are some of the more common mistakes that you just see investors in general making? Obviously, we've talked about some of the ones for specific areas, but what are the most common mistakes that you see in general?
I think
for investors.
I mean, across all asset classes, not just mortgage investors, but investors in general. Yeah. I think the biggest mistake that investors make is they underestimate risk. Okay. They don't give enough thought to the potential risk of any particular investment. And I think it's very apt that we're talking about this at this time.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's every now and then something comes along that nobody foresaw that really takes a bite out of asset prices. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the pandemic is doing so right now, whether it's stock prices, real estate prices, all kinds of asset prices have declined, business values, yeah. Right? And really, if you ask somebody 6 months ago, what are the risks that investors are facing in 2020, right. Nobody would have said pandemic.
Right, of course.
And if they did, you would have thought, what a crank, right? Yeah. This person probably wears a tinfoil hat and thinks aliens are talking to him. Yeah.
Or you might have believed that maybe a pandemic is possible, but to see what's occurring as a result, no one could have imagined that.
And Neil, I'll admit it. Obviously, I didn't foresee it. I'm sure you didn't foresee it. To me, 6 months ago, even 3 months ago, pandemics were things that happened in other places. Mm-hmm. They didn't happen in Canada. Mm-hmm. They didn't happen in the United States. They happened in countries far away.
Yeah.
And we saw them on TV and we read about them online. They don't happen here. But apparently they do happen here. And when they do happen, they can have very serious consequences. So people don't or underestimate these tail risk events. What former Defense Secretary of the United States Donald Rumsfeld called the unknown unknowns.
The unknown.
You have your known unknowns, or how much profit are the companies that make up the TSX 60 going to make this year? What is the price earnings multiple? Will the rates be lower or higher? Nobody knows, but at least we know that these things affect these markets. But these unknown unknowns, the financial crisis, 9/11, COVID-19, nobody can forecast them. Nobody can predict them. Certainly not with any kind of accuracy that makes them that allows you to act on them. Mm-hmm. But yet they have the biggest effect.
Yeah.
So what can you do? Well, what you can do is you can be cognizant of this risk that something may come out of the blue to affect your investments, to affect your ability to recoup your money. And you have to be cautious. You have to build in a margin of safety. As Ben Graham wrote in that classic, The Intelligent Investor, Ben Graham and Warren Buffett's favorite book, which I heartily recommend to everyone who is interested in investing. It's an oldie, but It's a classic, an excellent book.
The Intelligent Investor
by Ben Graham.
I've heard of it, but I've actually not read it myself. So,
well, next time you're in the city, I'll give you my copy.
Oh, thank you very much. So obviously, let's just talk a little bit about the current times that we're in, this current situation. we've seen a financial crisis before, not all that long ago, but we are seeing a bit of a two-headed dragon this time around with the pandemic, and we're in the middle of a financial crisis. What are your thoughts in general, and then what are your thoughts as it relates to real estate and real estate investments?
Yeah, I think you're right. While there's a lot of uncertainty in any kind of crisis, this one seems to be more pronounced.
Yeah.
Right. So we have not just unemployment and very deep recession and financial hardship and business failures, but we also have these health issues and health risks where people are afraid to go out.
Yeah.
People are afraid to, nowadays when I go for a walk,
to shake hands or walk on the side of the sidewalk.
Yeah, people are afraid. Everybody's in masks now with gloves on, and when you're walking towards someone on the sidewalk, either you veer off or they do so that they don't pass too close to you.
Yeah.
And that makes modern, urban, suburban living very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It makes doing business very difficult. It makes running a business very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a great deal of uncertainty as to how things will go from here.
Yeah.
Whether the things that we used to do, 6-8 months ago, we'll be able to do in the near future.
Right.
I mean, how likely are you, or really anyone, in the next year to go to a sporting event, a concert, a crowded restaurant, a Canada Day fireworks celebrate? Like, how likely is that to happen?
Yeah.
But if you think about all the businesses and jobs that depend on those events and those places that people normally socialize, it's a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
And so people don't know, am I going to have my job? Am I going to be able to make a living? Is my business going to be thriving, or at least surviving, or am I going to go under?
Mm-hmm.
And that all affects every part of the economy, including real estate, right? So if you've got commercial properties and you've got restaurants or bars that are your tenants, are they going to be able to pay rent?
Mm-hmm.
If they can't, how much can they pay? And if they go under, who are you going to find to replace them?
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't rent out those properties, well, what are they worth?
Yeah.
And that cascades on down. Well, maybe then you can't make your mortgage payment, and the bank has to take over. Well, who are they going to sell it to, right? So it's this domino effect of debt and failure and kind of businesses going under that causes this cycle of recession, this recessionary, depressionary cycle.
Well, I'm seeing something interesting happening even right now. We've been on lockdown for a couple of months, and it looks like people that were planning on putting their homes up for sale a couple of months ago obviously didn't at that point in time. But I've seen literally in the last couple of days, just within my area, I've seen 8 for sale signs all pop up simultaneously, and we're not even, the lockdown hasn't even been removed yet. And
yeah, you got to wonder: are these people selling because they want to sell, or because they have to sell? Now, traditionally, this is the time of the year where you want to start putting your house on the market. The spring market is,
right,
in Canada, traditionally the most active.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, to me, I don't know why anyone who doesn't have to put their property on the market right now, put their property on the market. It doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense in this kind of economic environment, this kind of health environment. It's just difficult logistically to sell a house, right, let alone find somebody who's going to pay what you want them to pay and can afford to pay it.
Right. Now, this is wide debate on this topic. Are we going to see a drop in prices? There is so much media out there that will will actually say the opposite. Now the banks have started coming out, and economists are saying 5 to 10%, drop in prices, in home prices. But there are so many sources that are saying prices are going up.
I saw something on the news today from the Greater Toronto Real Estate Board that said the prices have gone down year over year in Toronto. Obviously, volumes have dropped 2/3.
Right.
That's not surprising.
Right.
And I guess it shouldn't be surprising that when volumes drop, prices drop. Now, volumes have dropped by 2/3, and prices, according to their calculations, have dropped 2%. But it's one of the few drops in quite a while that we've seen. And another thing that I found maybe even more interesting is rental rates have dropped.
Really?
Yeah. So what they're saying is that, that is surprising. Rental rates have dropped.
Yeah.
A couple of months ago, there were multiple offers on rental condos in Toronto, especially in the core. And in the Greater Toronto area, rents have fallen, not by a lot, but maybe 1-2%, but they've fallen.
Now, what would you attribute that to?
I attribute it to the fact that people aren't looking to move.
Yeah.
They're maybe afraid, they're staying put. People who may have been looking to rent a condo or rent a house or rent an apartment have lost jobs, or they're worried about their jobs, or their income's been reduced, and they're no longer in the market. So I think the demand has significantly dried up for rental accommodation.
Now that's
whereas landlords, if you have a place to rent, well, you want to rent it out. There's no use to you sitting empty and waiting.
Yeah.
You want somebody in there paying rent. But the renters themselves are maybe shying away a bit.
Yeah. But that's really interesting, because with home sales dwindling, normally you then see a corresponding raise in the rental markets, right? More people are choosing to rent rather than buy.
Right.
But now we're seeing a slight drop on both sides.
Yeah, and this, I think, speaks to the kind of how frozen this market is.
With the parents?
Yeah. People are moving back home with the parents. They're not moving out.
Yeah.
Maybe they planned to. Maybe they were living in a house with roommates and wanted their own place. Not doing so. Maybe recent graduates can't find a job, so they're no longer in the market for.
You have come across
for a rental
on that, yeah.
So I think there's all kinds of reasons why rental demand has dropped, and they all factor into the falling prices of rental accommodation.
That's very interesting. I'm just trying to think.
Because normally you think, well, people aren't buying, but they have to live somewhere, so they're going to rent instead of buy. Yeah. That's the trade-off, right? Am I going to buy? I'm going to rent. People aren't buying, and they're not renting, which is a little frightening.
Right. So, in the short term, all the predictions are we're looking at a price drop for obviously real estate. And I always like to say this: real estate is always going to be regional and local when you talk about it. I know we like to talk about national statistics and the national home price, and these things don't obviously exist. You're not going to find a national home. What you're going to find is a home, even in a property in a specific province, is still going to be further priced differently based on where it is, what city it is in that province, and then of course what area it is. And so, this will affect different locations very differently. Obviously, we can see our brothers and sisters in Alberta are being affected greatly in this time with everything that's happening with oil. But we're also seeing significant issues out west in British Columbia, where they're running into they're running into deficit issues with regards to the governments, right? The municipalities are actually running out of money out there, and now they're starting to talk about it here as well. But you know,
I've heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was actually reading that I believe Vancouver has already requested from BC, from the province, is requesting stimulus. They're requesting aid because they are beyond their balanced budget, which they're required to, of course, run a balanced budget, and so.
That's right. In Canada, in most provinces, the legislation requires the municipalities to run a balanced budget every year. They can't borrow or they can't go into deficit.
Yeah.
Same thing in Ontario.
Yeah.
So you either raise taxes or cut spending or get somebody to give you money.
Right.
And since all municipalities are creatures of the province that they are located in,
right,
and they're regulated by the province, they go to the province to see if they can get the bailout.
Mm-hmm. Wow, there's so many intricacies in what's happening. One of the things that I do want to talk about, because it's obviously connected to real estate investing, is we are in a situation where right now even the courts are closed, and so that has impacts for what we've spoken about. Can you talk to that at all?
Well, the courts, at least I think pretty much across Canada, but definitely in Ontario, are closed for anything other than routine processing of documents or emergency hearings.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had a trial scheduled, it's been postponed.
Mm-hmm.
If you had a motion scheduled, it's been postponed. If you'd like to sue someone, you can start the process, but it can't go any further than that. Mm-hmm. So all these things are on hold.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to collect a debt, it's on hold. If you want to, have a divorce settlement, it's on hold. If you want to sue for an injury you've suffered in a car accident or on the bus, or if you slipped, it's on hold. Even a lot of criminal trials that are not serious are on hold. Mm-hmm. So it creates a problem if you want to enforce any legal rights in the province or anywhere else, frankly, in Canada, because you can't. Mm-hmm. Unless you have an urgent matter, whatever that means. You wait. We wait.
Okay, so that brings up an interesting question for me, is if we are seeing right now, we're seeing people that wanted to move and they held off on putting their homes up for sale. Now we're starting to see a number of homes hitting the market simultaneously. And we're going to potentially see distressed situations, right? They get in, they're beyond, they're not going to be able to make their payments. Their debts have gotten beyond reach, and they're going to put their homes up for sale and move on from there. We've barely even talked about those that own Airbnbs and how they're affected and how they're going to be affected for a while to come, because they're not opening up short-term rentals anytime soon. And if you ask me, I don't know if they're going to open them up for a while because of the conflict with the hotel industry. I think they're going to try to save the hotel industry, and Airbnbers are going to have to figure it out for themselves. So roll all of this together, all of these properties hitting the market simultaneously, and then as well, you've got properties that may be in default, but because the courts are closed, those can't go to the market yet. They can't be put up for sale yet. And now those will also be added on to the pile when you put everything together. And
it's going to be like a fire hose. They're all going to come out at the same time.
Yeah, that seems like, I hate to call it this, but it seems like a perfect storm for a lot of downward pressure on homes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is going to be a lot of downward pressure on homes. I think there'll be more and more people who will need to sell.
Yeah.
I think the defaults will eventually find their way into the market whenever the green light's given to start enforcing those defaults. Timing is obviously uncertain. We don't know when that'll happen. But whenever it happens, whether it's this summer, this fall, or beginning of next year, the downward pressure on real estate prices will be, I think, quite significant. I don't make predictions. I don't know, but it seems to me inconceivable that there is no decline in real estate prices. I would be shocked if there wasn't.
Okay, so just purely speculation and opinion. We know that 5 to 10% seems a reasonable amount for the government to allow. Maybe even 15%. But I can't see the government allowing much beyond that without trying to find some way to inject some sort of stimulus into the market. Because I don't know if they can afford to allow the real estate market to crash. Would you agree with that, or?
Well, I think it would be a very bad thing for the economy if there was a real estate crash.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what else the government can do. They've already put the rates down to next to nothing.
Yeah.
They're handing out stimulus checks like handy at Halloween. You get a check and you get a check and you get a check. Everybody's getting a check. I'm not really sure what they can do to stimulate the market. It seems to me that the real estate market is one of the few that's the most resistant to any kind of government manipulation.
Yeah.
Because once buyers lose confidence in the market, and once there's an event that holds people back from buying their house, getting them to do so, I think, is quite difficult. Rebuilding that confidence, rebuilding that belief that the property will be worth more in the future and not less, I think is going to be challenging once the prices start falling. And frankly, that's where the money is to be made for people who have the intestinal fortitude and the cash to jump in. Right? So it's when things are bleakest.
Yeah.
Is when the money's made.
Well, historically, the government has allowed crashes to happen, but we've not seen these types of elevated values before, right?
Right.
And so it is interesting to watch over what's happening right now, and obviously with everything that's going on and people just worrying about their own safety, health and safety first, and we don't know, is there going to be a second wave of COVID-19, or there's so little that we know about the pandemic itself that it leads into so many questions. And so, as you talk about UER, underestimating risk, what would you say to investors at this time, whether they're looking at buying and renting or fixing and flipping or private mortgages? What would you say to investors as a
I would say to investors, and I'm not an investment advisor, so all the caveats are present. You have to go into the transaction, into the investment, with building in a margin of safety. Right? You have to know that if you're going to be okay if the market is down 15 or 20%. You have to be confident that you can ride out a difficult period of several years and not have to liquidate your investment. Because as we all know, real estate's not a liquid investment. You can't, hit a button on your computer and get out of a position like you can in the stock, right? It's expensive and it's time consuming, and the carrying costs are significant. So you've got to know as a real estate investor that you can hang in there for the long term. Whether you're buying a property or you're flipping a property or you're buying a pre-construction and holding that, or you're investing in mortgages, right? You have to know that I built in a margin of safety so that I'm going to be okay if there's a downturn in the market. I'm going to be okay I don't need that money to pay my bills. I'm going to have food on the table. I'm going to have a roof over my head. I'm going to have gas in the tank. If I have a couple of years to wait until that money comes back to me, I'm going to be okay. And I'm doing this on the understanding that it's a long-term commitment, and that I understand that things can go wrong, and that 20% of the value can go poof. Of course, more than 20% value can go poof, but there's only so many things you can protect yourself against. Right. If an asteroid comes and hits the earth, then the value of your real estate investments really is irrelevant, right? So there's only so much protection or risk mitigation that you can do, but you have to do it. Right.
Well said. As a lawyer, as you would expect a lawyer to. So that definitely makes sense, and I think it's good advice. I think it's important. One of the things, the reason for me even starting this podcast was to try to remove a lot of the misconceptions in the different areas. And I called it the Leadership to Wealth podcast, because there is a certain amount of leadership that each one of us needs to take. And I really appreciate what you're talking about here with most investors underestimating risk. And so if we're going to take leadership to creating wealth, the number one thing you're going to have to do is obviously manage your risk and do a better job of assessing risk, whether it be real estate, whether it be stocks, whether it be whatever type of investment class you go into. There's going to be a certain amount of leadership that you're going to have to take just in your own life and with your own money to be able to get
Absolutely. There. And what I find people do is a common mistake is they extrapolate the present trends into the future, on the assumption that the present will just continue into the future, just in a slightly different way. And that never happens, at least not in any long-term sense. Something fundamental always changes. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to predict what that thing will be. But what you've got to know is I've built in a margin of safety for myself where I know that if things do go wrong, I'm going to be okay. Whatever that thing is, I've planned for a difficult patch of years, and I'm pretty confident I can ride it out. So that's what I recommend to people. That's the way I try to structure my own investments too.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the way you try to structure your clients' investments if you're advising people. Don't assume that everything is going to be great. In fact, assume the opposite, that things will not be great.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do if something goes wrong?
That's right.
How will you manage? Are you going to be able to ride this out? Or do you have to liquidate and sell at the worst possible time where you're going to have the maximum possible losses?
Right.
Which is exactly what you don't want to do.
Right.
You want to be buying then, not selling then. Right? Because if people have the guts and the foresight and the, as I said, the intestinal fortitude, when you buy at the point of maximum pessimism, there's no place to go but up. Right? And if you buy when things are great and everybody's making money and things are perfect and it's all butterflies and unicorns, there's no place to go but down. Eventually.
Right. Well, it's interesting to me that if people have not experienced a down market, then they're always going to be expecting things to be good, and they will not prepare themselves. I've actually been telling a lot of people right now is the best time to start a business, because you're going to look around and take into account things that someone that started when everything was good would never have thought to take into account.
Absolutely right.
Business for the worst possible scenario. Hence, when a good time comes, you're already ready to go.
And Neil, I think I agree with you completely. If you're a young person and you're starting out in your career or in business or in investing, if you're beginning now, the fates have almost given you a gift. of lower asset prices. You can buy things cheaper than you could just 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And that's great for the younger set. Guys a little more vintage like ourselves, maybe that's not so good because you've already accumulated a few things and they've gone down in price. But you know, if you're starting out now, as bad as it may look on the surface, I think, you know, you're going to build resiliency. You're going to have a different mode of thinking. You're going to have a different way of approaching the world and how you navigate your business and professional, your work career. And, you know, once you go through a set of these crises, you know, you don't panic. You become more resilient. You got to build your personal resilience. So I've been through the early 90s real estate crash. I've been through the dot-com bubble, 9/11, financial crisis, a few smaller ones sprinkled in, and now this. And maybe this is the biggest one of all because of what it is. But you learn that, you know, eventually there's a way out.
Right.
That things will be better, and that you know, if you keep your wits about you, you look for opportunities and you don't panic, plan, think about your risks, that you're going to be okay. You're going to do fine.
Okay, so given all of that, what's next for you? You're still teaching?
I'm still teaching. In fact, I'm teaching more this summer than I've ever taught before.
Okay.
I've got more students, so I've got more courses on my plate, and I'm teaching remotely. And I'm going to have to learn how to do that effectively, which, you know, I've never done that before. So it's going to be something new that I have to learn and get used to and cope with. Where, you know, probably wouldn't have had to do that if it wasn't for this crisis.
Right.
And I'm going to have to pivot my business in a way that will maximize the revenue coming in, because the reduction in real estate volume has affected my business significantly. Everyone in the business has been affected significantly. So I'm gonna have to learn and to structure the business or to pivot the business to maximize revenue. Well,
I hear that everyone's saying that there's going to be a whole lot of divorces after the lockdown is
yes.
lifted. So you may have to pivot and add that.
Add that to. I tell you what has been a growth industry for me is doing people's wills.
Okay.
The virus and the being cooped up at home and watching the news has caused them to feel a greater sense of mortality.
Yeah.
So we're doing a lot more of those than we used to do.
Now, do you remember a conversation you and I had about that?
I do. Yeah, I do.
Didn't think it was as great an idea then, but sounds like a good idea now.
It sounds like a much better idea now.
That's great. So, Henry, as we wrap up here, what as you move forward, what are things that you're trying to transition, you know, with business and that? Is there anything else that you want to leave? Any other message you want to leave with the listeners? And then also, if people want to get a hold of you, if they're looking for a lawyer or they want to get more information, also if you could give us how people can get a hold of you.
Yeah, sure. But I think as far as, you know, people are obviously listening to this podcast because they want to take greater control of their own investing lives or their personal financial futures, right? So they want to take on a greater role of responsibility in their families and their own lives, right? So given that, I say to those people, if you're thinking of pursuing a particular investment or a particular type of investment knowledge, do your research, use all the available resources available to you, talk to people, ask questions, find out what people who got experience have to say, and then but don't allow others to think for you. Make your own judgment in the end. Like, it's your money, it's your family, it's your future. The research is important, but at the end of the day, you know yourself, and you have to make your own decisions as to what you're going to pursue and what you're not going to pursue. So I think that's very important. Nobody can tell you what you need. Nobody knows what you need more than you know yourself. And once, know thyself, that ancient maxim, I think is very important, especially times like these. As far as getting hold of me, easiest way is either by phone or by email. The office number is 416-439-9559. The easiest way to get a hold of me by email is hplaw, HPLAW, at bellnet.ca. That's BELLNET.ca. And of course, they can always get a hold of you, and you know how to get a hold of me. So that's also
It's true.
an easy way for somebody to get a hold of me if they need to.
Yeah. Well, Henry, we've gone over time, but I want to thank you for all of the wisdom that you shared. Obviously, the wisdom that you've shared with me over the years that we've known one another, and what we'll continue to share as we continue to help people down their investment journeys. So, but I do want to thank you for coming on to the podcast and being one of my first guests. And we'll definitely do it again in the future. And
Neil,
we'll shake hands again at some point.
Well, maybe a few years from now, yeah. But we'll have to wait. Neil, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on the podcast. I really enjoyed our talk. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.